What is up, everybody? I'm sure you guys are able to tell that I'm not doing a piano video this time around, since you've definitely read this title here that's above me somewhere, either to my right or to my left. Or you've noticed that I'm not doing my usual sitting down. And you know what I'm doing here if you realize both of those things. But on a more professional note, I'm here today to give a little bit of a lecture on why this book here, The Diagnosis and Corrections of Vocal Faults by James C. McKinney, should be a required text for a hypothetical new basic vocal pedagogy course that would be here at Bowling Green State University. If you want more information, more details on what I am doing here, details will be down here in the description. And without further ado, let's begin. Now, with diagnosing vocal faults, there's a thing called a diagnostic process. That can come with diagnosing basically any type of condition or any type of problem, where a doctor or in this case, he's teacher, would have their own informal observations and when starting teaching a new student, and then those students or patients, because I'll be using both terminologies here in this specific point in time. Like the doctor/teacher makes informal observations about what the student is doing within the lesson, and then the students kind of self-evaluate what they're doing and how they're doing, and then we go back to the doctor/teacher, and then they do like systematic testing, kind of like in musical terms that's more like auditioning. And the whole point of the diagnostic process is to find specific symptoms, basically what the heck is wrong, and finding the specific causes, which is the why is this specific incorrect thing happening, and cures, which in this case would be how do I fix this. And in identifying vocal problems in a student, a voice teacher needs three things. One, an amazing knowledge of how the voice works and the mechanism itself. Without being able to understand that, you're not going to be able to know in general what is going through your students' bodies. The second thing is you need to have the ability to allow your student to understand what you're saying. Talk like the student, plain and simple. If you talk in any type of esoteric way, to where the student might not understand what you're saying, you're doing it wrong. That's just how it is. And the third thing that you would need when identifying vocal problems, oddly enough, is a mastery in psychological skills. Which I'm not going to go too far in depth with that because it's kind of a weird thing that psychology is not my forte. And I probably could have remembered more stuff about the psychological skills. It's just something he was able to put onto my presentation. Now, in diagnosing in a teaching studio, the key to making it work is to make the first hearing of a student singing, so basically like if with them sight reading a piece in this case, you want to make that experience as a positive experience. Yes, you'll have to lay down firm guidelines and crystal clear expectations, but you don't have to be negative about it. That's the thing. Because there's such a thing as constructive criticism, which is extremely important when it comes to teaching, because you don't want students to be discouraged. And there are various different classifications of vocal faults in particular, which I will go a little bit in depth later on in the presentation in this lecture, where you can classify vocal faults by pitch, intensity, duration, timbre, and sonance. And then I mentioned what the plan of action for diagnosing is. You have to recognize specific symptoms and what's wrong. And for that, you can get both visible and audible clues. So like one thing that you can do to be able to find and recognize symptoms is at one point do 2 hearings without any criticism. The first one, you would close your eyes, or vice versa. So for the first hearing, you would either close your eyes or leave them open and focus more on what you see. And for the second hearing, you would do the opposite. For me, my suggestion would be to close your eyes and listen for any audible clues. And then on the second hearing, open your eyes. See what their face looks like, because as different visible and audible clues, or different visible clues, actually affect what you hear. So there's a little bit of a difference in that. And determining why such a thing is wrong, it kind of ties back to having masterful psychology skills. You have to use kind of an empathy type thing, like being able to demonstrate kind of what needs to happen in there, or like the comparison between what the student did and what's correct, and something like that. And then like devising a cure, like fixing the problem. Part of that comes with using empathy as well. Well, in that, sorry, I'm having a brain fart there. In that you're kind of using the demonstration of comparison here with what your student probably did and what that you would prefer to hear. That's part of devising the cure, because you're demonstrating the correct one. Now, our next place here is the basic approach to a vocal sound. And the nature of sound, and you have here, sound is caused by hearing vibrations. And yes, the vibrations are technically called sound waves, but you hear the vibrations, and then we call it sound. And like the different parts of sound, I mentioned them in the last bit. You have pitch, which is the frequency of the vibration, so basically the numerical idea of the pitch. Then there's intensity, which is the amount of energy within the sound. And then you have duration, which is probably the most obvious one out of that, which is how long the musical tone lasts. Then there's timbre, which is basically the distinguishing factor between different people's voices. And then you have sonance, which is kind of a culmination of pitch, intensity, and timbre. And it's the pattern of the changes in those three. Now, for singers, our instrument is inside of us, and we have different pieces of our instrument. We have actuators, which supply energy and power to our next piece of the musical instrument, which is the vibrator, which vibrators generate the sound waves, the vibrations, that cause sound to be heard. And then there are resonators, which control the intensity and timbre of the sound waves. And resonators can also be secondary vibrators, just because of the fact that they're controlling parts of the sound wave. Now, with vocal sound, there are 4 main aspects when it comes to a vocal sound. There's respiration, which I'm sure most of you know is breathing. Phonation, which is producing the sound via the vibration of the vocal cords in your larynx, which is here-ish, which I don't remember what end. I think it's around here at your voice box. Because then there's resonation, which is the enhancement of the sound production. And then there's articulation, which is the speech sounds becoming recognizable when the vibrators and resonators join forces. Now, a little bit of more exactness for the articulation. You have vowels that are unrestricted, usually sustained, or they can be sustained, normally phonated, so sung. And they usually carry the tone. If they're being sustained, they must carry the tone, right? And they have a definite shape, meaning each vowel has a specific way that you have your mouth open for. And then you have consonants, which are very much different from vowels. They're restricted. They contain more noise elements. Hence they are kind of background-ish when it comes to vowels in singing. The consonants will always border syllables, or it borders most syllables, and the consonants are sound interrupters, meaning consonants always go between vowels. And one of the main debates in the book here is that there is no exact science when it comes to describing vocal sound, meaning some of the stuff I even said just now, it can be interpreted in many, many different ways. Now, our next chapter, I probably should have told you, there are 11 chapters in this book, and we're on chapter 3 now, which is about posture. And a rationale for good posture is that the good posture and good singing are related to one another, meaning you can't have one without the other, aka you can't have good singing without good posture, and you can't really have, and it's a lot of cause and effect in there. And trying to, when arriving to good posture, one of the things I really liked about this chapter is that you have to kind of set up positive thought patterns to be able to get into the mindset of, hey, I'm going to get into good posture. And one of the other things that help, because I'm a music major, but I had a background in sports when I was a younger child. So one of the things I liked about this is with posture is that in arriving to good posture, it also helps to stretch parts of your body like an athlete before performing or practicing, which you can utilize this very much so in a choral rehearsal. Well, it's just a little bit weirder to do it one-on-one. And I mean, I've been talking about how good posture and how to get there, but how are you going to know what it is if I don't tell you? And so good posture, you would have weight evenly distributed between both of your feet, and usually you would have one foot slightly in front of the other, just so that you kind of have a little bit of balance, and you're actually more stable that way. If you're more straight on, you're more susceptible to be pushed backwards. It's another part of good posture is that the legs should be ready to move at all times, and within that, never lock your knees. Make sure your knees are always moving freely as well, because your knees are part of your legs. If your knees aren't going to move, your legs aren't going to move. The next step is for the hips and butt to kind of conform to this vertical line from the feet to the head, which with the head I'll explain near to the end of this a little explanation. And your lower abdomen here needs to be comfortable. Your upper abdomen here, where my right hand is, this needs to be much like your legs. It needs to be ready to move, because here, that's about where your diaphragm is. Because if this area here cannot move freely, you're not going to be able to breathe properly. And you need to, now with your back, you straighten the small of your back, which basically means, hey, don't make your butt protrude. Just stay like that. Your chest needs to be comfortably high, your shoulders gently rolled back and settled into the socket. Arms and hands are hanging naturally and freely. Your head is centered on your shoulders and you're never raising your chin. Now, there's a little bit of a difference with seated posture where your feet and legs don't necessarily matter as much, but for a better seated posture, always keep your feet apart if you're a guy in particular. You're always try to keep yourself grounded while you're sitting. And some very particular posture faults, there are alignment faults. So basically, any of the last few things I said, if anything is out of place, like, oh hey, my chin is up here, that's a fault. Then there are also some tensional faults, which can be seen if the student is shaking, which you'll find very, very often if your student locks their knees, because then they'll start shaking, or if they got so used to locking their knees, they're absolutely rigid. And they just aren't moving. And that's important to be able to know those particular faults, considering good singing comes with good posture. You need to have good posture for it. Now, I just mentioned breathing when I was talking about the different parts that needed to be right for posture. Now, the entire mechanism with breathing, you have air. You get air entering the body as a result of differing atmospheric pressures between in the inside of your body, like with your lungs and oral cavity, and the outside of the body, which is all out here. Now, I mentioned the diaphragm. You can basically describe it as the floor to your chest and the ceiling to your abdomen. And the lungs rely on the diaphragm's movement. So when you breathe in, the diaphragm expands down, making room for the lungs to expand a little bit. And then you breathe out, the diaphragm comes back, meaning the lungs come back to normal. Now, in breathing for singing, there are 4 different categories, or stages, I should say. There's the inhalation, which, coming back to posture here, the chest must be comfortably high, and the lower abdomen must be comfortably in, and then the upper abdomen must be free to move. All of these things here need to be correct to be able to inhale properly. Because without, specifically upper abdomen, because that is the center of this entire inhalation process. And one of the other keys is don't make noise when you breathe in. And because you're not going to need to if air intake is actually caused by the result of different atmospheric pressures, because the air wants to come into the body. And then there's also, This second stage here for singing, it's one that's not usually used in singing, which is called suspension, which is basically means you're preparing for our next step, which is phonation and controlled exhalation, where during that stage, since you're singing, you're maintaining the expansion of the middle of the body here, meaning abdomen, chest. And the length of this stage is determined by the demand of whatever musical phrase you're singing. Our last stage here is the recovery, where all of your muscles will become relaxed. Since you are exhaling throughout the entire phonation period. During this recovery stage, you can catch your breath, or you can grab a little bit of a breath there to restart your breathing process. Now, there's these wonderful things called catch breaths that with most musical phrases you kind of have to do. And catch breaths are shorter breaths right in between two different phrases. So like if you have an extremely long phrase, you put a catch break. You put a catch breath right in the middle there, or where it makes sense. And when that kind of happens, these in the recovery, the catch breaths accelerate the recovery stage because as your muscles are relaxing and you have to breathe in right then and there. And then support, breath support in itself. Now I mentioned that the different parts of vocal instruments are actuators, vibrators, and resonators. The breath is the actuator of a singer. It is what brings energy and power. Breath support in itself is the dynamic relationship between the inner and outer muscles here. So like with the diaphragm in particular, and the different abdominal muscles that are brought out because of the diaphragm moving. And then breath control is the dynamic relationship between the breath itself and the vocal cords. Seems pretty simple there, right? Now with phonation, the larynx is the main part of this process. Yes, and the larynx forms the uppermost unit of the windpipe, which is about here. The larynx is also known as the voice box, which I'm pretty sure I mentioned earlier, where the vocal sound originates from. It's not where your power originates from. Remember, that's here. The voice box, that's where your vocal cords lie. In the phonatory process, you have a couple different theories. These where you have a muscle elasticity theory, where the pressure builds up in the muscles until the vocal cords are pushed apart in the muscles inside of the larynx in particular. And then you have the air action theory, where the breath that is flowing past the vocal cords causes them to be sucked into a vibration. And although both of these theories could actually be true and working simultaneously to initiate and maintain in the vibration. And with good vocal sound, which that's what phonation is, you're producing vocal sound, and you have to make it freely and consistently produced. It also needs to be pleasant to the ear. It should be loud enough to hear. So you don't want to be like this. It's because I'm not sure if you can hear me or not. Then there's also the triple R, which is rich, ringing, and resonant. They're all kind of similar in a sense. It's there. And then you would also need to have smooth flowing energy between the notes, which I'll mention this much later in this lecture. You need some vibrato. That's kind of what energy does. Is you need to be flexibly expressive, and then you also need to be vibrant, dynamic, and alive. You basically don't look dead. And it is actually impossible to produce vocal sound without the assistance of the breath. But it's not necessary to phonate while breathing. That's because you can just breathe in and breathe out. You don't necessarily have to make a noise, actually, with phonating, because there's also with the different articulations and stuff, which might be, nope, that's not the next one. So I mentioned that consonants are basically noise. A lot of them are noise. That's kind of what it means when it says it's not necessary to phonate while breathing. Or, oh, wait, no, I am misinterpreting that now. It's not necessary to phonate while breathing because you're not supposed to make noise while breathing. Makes sense, right? Now, our next part here is about different registers. So, what is a register exactly? Well, there's multiple different definitions that can be used here. Here, including a particular part of the vocal range, an area of resonance in a singer, a specific phonatory process, and then there's a certain timbre to the voice, and then a region of the voice defined by vocal breaks, which I'm sure, or for those of you that have taken music classes before, have heard the term passaggio. That's basically kind of where your vocal breaks tend to happen. And there are about, well, as revealed by its very specific research by McKinney himself, or as stated in the book by McKinney, there are 4 different types of registers. You have your normal, which is called modal voice. It's a normal register for speaking and singing, and most of the confusion lies here in that voice, because you can kind of make it a little bit rangy in a sense, and you all have heard of the terms chest voice and head voice. It has been described that head voice is kind of a combination between chest voice and falsetto, which falsetto just lies above and overlaps the modal voice and is actually utilized a lot, especially with male singers. Is you're not going to find it much with female singers because it's not usually necessary for a female singers to use falsetto, because they're never usually going above there. And even then, the altos might use falsetto up there, but we're not going to find altos singing that note. And aside from that, there are 2 very extreme registers that aren't generally used very much. We'll start with a whistle tone, in which the whistle tones have the highest frequency, so like those notes up here, up way at the end on the right side of the piano, which, unless your name is Mitch Grassi, whistle tones are not meant for adult men at all. Well, and I mentioned Mitch Grassi because I've seen other videos of him actually making whistle tones, which is impressive by all means, but not normal. Well, and then you have one that's specific to a lot of lower voices in the vocal fry, which is a super low frequency, which you can find it for guys anywhere down all the way to the left of the piano, and even for some women it can be like somewhere in what would normally be the middle range for a guy. And with vocal fry, vocal fry is specifically used to obtain pitches normally unachievable by the modal voice going lower, not going higher. That's why you have falsetto. Oh, and moderate use of vocal fry shouldn't damage your normal voice. It's when you use vocal fry in excess when you start finding damage in your student's voice or in your voice. Because that's why you kind of hear me talking in different registers sometimes, or almost very specifically in modal voice. That's because it's normal. It's normal. And I can go higher as well. But in this case, I think we should move on. Because with registers are a key in helping with voice classification. Because singing outside of the normal natural voice range can strain the voice. Now there are different criteria for establishing a voice classification. And first you got range, which concerns the total compass of a voice part. So, like for example, for a tenor, like a low note there and a high note there, or a more comfortable high note there. Or then there's tessitura, which is concerned with specific parts of the vocal range and relies solely on vocal comfort and can determine whether or not you put a mezzo-soprano in the alto or soprano sections or a baritone in the tenor or bass sections. And if you're in an SATB group, if you're teaching an SATB group. Then there's also timbre, which is the most risky because assumptions can be very misleading, and students are notorious for misclassifying themselves because they think that based off of like what they were doing in the past couple years is what they're going to be doing their entire lives. I'm one of those cases. Is because I thought for the longest time I was meant to sing super low. Meanwhile, all the while I can still sing kind of low, I'm not meant to sing super low. Oh, and then you have transition points, and most teachers are going to lean on this style here, because if you know where a student's break point is, which for a lot of guys it's those middle notes, it's those notes in and around on the middle C. And one of the other things with transition points is different vowels have different points. Like if your ah vowel, you could have a break point there, but your oo vowel, it could be down here. There's differences between the vowels. And there's 7 steps to classifying voices in a choral audition. But the main key there is to not be in a hurry. The entire point is to be able to get it right and make sure that your students are singing healthily and aren't hurting themselves while singing. Because the dangers of misclassification is you lose some of the tonal beauty and the freedom of your own vocal production. You can actually shorten your singing career, meaning because you're supposed to be able to sing until you die. And if you misclassify somebody's voice and it sticks, then they could possibly not be able to sing when they're in their 50s. And then there's also continuing frustration and disappointment, mostly when it comes to the students. It's because they'll feel like they're not doing something right and will get frustrated and disappointed with themselves. And then there's obviously the possibility of serious vocal damage, because if you misclassify somebody, like if you put somebody who's supposed to sing bass and make them sing tenor, the only way that they'll be able to do it healthily is if they use falsetto, which we don't want them to have to do, because it's not necessary most of the time. Now I was talking about basses. Is in barbershop style, basses are known for being ridiculously resonant. Now, resonation is the product, or is the basic, resonation is phonation being enhanced by the air-filled cavities on its way to the outside air. Resonation is the product where everything you do to phonate is enhanced by that. And resonators are affected by factors such as size, meaning, size of this here. Or shape, which different vowels give you different shapes. Here's the type of opening. Again, different vowels give you a different type of opening. And then there's the composition and thickness of the walls, meaning it's more of stuff of back here, or different combined resonators. So a lot of times you'll be getting combined resonators. Here's here. And the different types of resonators here are the ones that are that should be most important to you are your pharynx, aka your throat. So here on either side there. And there's 3 different parts of the pharynx here. Because you have the area here, back here, over by where your nasal cavity is. You have the part up here-ish, kind of, somewhere in there. And then you have the area right by your oral cavity. And then you have the part that is nearest your larynx and esophagus. And they all work, most of the time they all work together. And your second most important resonator, which I already mentioned, is your oral cavity. And the oral cavity's main function is supplying consonants and joining the pharynx to form vowel sounds. So I'm going to come back to the pharynx here. So with the 3 parts of the pharynx, the part of the pharynx nearest to the oral cavity is your most important part of your pharynx. For resonation. Because you might be able to feel it up here over by your nose, because it can happen that way. You could feel it more, or down here in your chest, in your neck, which would be nearest to your larynx. And your third most important, which again I just mentioned, your nasal cavity, up here, over by where your nose is, and a little bit back. And yes, it's an unadjustable cavity. And it's hard to utilize it well. You just generally don't have to think about it. But then there are other different resonators, like the tracheal tree here, which part of your windpipe. It has a set resonant frequency, and using it too much actually has a negative effect on you. And then the other different parts that some of them don't have a major effect, your chest, it's a resonator, but it doesn't contribute to the resonance system in your voice. And your sinuses they simply just can't exert any significant influence on your vocal tone. And then your larynx, it's not really important, but you get your high frequencies and overtones, brilliances, and ring. Because ring is a word that's utilized a lot more, where a chord, it locks and then it rings. that type of chord is gonna lock and ring when everything is in tune and when everything is right in everyone's voices. Albeit, a SATB choir is not likely going to sing this chord in this iteration. It'll probably be kind of like that, or that. There's differences, and when you can adjust your resonators, like you can adjust a little bit of the position of your larynx, things in your, because that's just a lot of messing around with your vocal cords. You can have an open throat, meaning pharynx, open pharynx. Things you can raise your soft palate, which in turn will open up more of the oral cavity. Your external orifice, which is your lips, and a term that I'm not gonna force you to know, which is a formant. I'm gonna move on to our next thing, which is articulation. Ugh. How ironic that I said that word wrong. So like the articulatory process, it is the joint product of the vibrator and the resonators. Articulation is that joint product, and it's articulation is the joint product of vibrators and resonators being shaped into recognizable speech through speech organ movement and muscular adjustments. Meaning you get consonants and vowels. And you have different voiced consonants, unvoiced consonants, and some different vowels. And then you also have different phonemes, which it's just like the example in the book. Like you have like a T and a D. Like if you get the word till, you have 3 different pieces, phonemes. It's a lot of IPA references is mostly. And then like changing one utterly changes it. Now how you would establish a good articulatory habits is using your articulators properly, which your articulators are your lips, your lower jaw, and your tongue. That. Now very specific faults. Well, it's obviously you can incorrectly use your lips, tongue, or jaw. Like one of the ones that I'm a culprit of is overusing my jaw when I sing, because that's kind of how I was taught initially, and it's something that I'm working on. And then you could also have faulty consonants or vowels, meaning you definitely didn't have if it's vowels, you did not have the right spacing in your oral cavity to get those vowels. Or you could have disconnected sounds, meaning you kind of may or may not have accidentally stopped partway through. And now with the speaking voice, we're talking about singing, but the speaking voice is really important as well. Well, the basic mechanism for speaking and singing, they're both the same. And both processes involved are essentially the same as well. Although there are some main differences, yes. Speech generally moves at a faster rate than singing, but singing has more extended vowels and even more consonant sounds as well. And in particular, normal speech has a little bit of a restricted range. I'm not the best example for that, because I've been kind of going down and up a little bit, although I could be wrong in saying that. Now there are different speech levels. There's what you would normally call normal. I'm going to call it habitual, which is the limited range used in everyday speech. And then there's optimal, which, if you know what the word optimal means in general, it's literally just the best quality and quantity of sound for the least exerted effort. So optimal speech, you don't want to give so much effort with it, right? Now, there are specific faults with the different aspects of speaking and singing, like pitch, quantity, and rate. Like with pitch, if you are constantly speaking too high or too low, you're wrong. If you're speaking in too restricted of a range, meaning if you're talking like a two-note Tommy, you're wrong. And if you're speaking in stereotyped patterns, so like if you're constantly saying sentences, regular sentences, like you're asking a question, no, people don't like you. And with quantity, there's the issue of speaking too loud or too soft. It's more common to hear people talking too soft, because part of that is like, oh, a little bit of fry could be happening there if you're talking too soft. And the other issue with quantity is speaking with too much variation of force. Just being like, huh, that kind of, or like, it's like not being consistent with your gravitas in your voice. And then with rate, there's an issue of speaking too fast or too slow. Speaking too fast, you're just harder to understand. And speaking too slow, people want you to speed up. Plain and simple. And the other issue there is not being able to decide what rate you're speaking at. And you're overly inconsistent with that, because how in the world are you going to be able to sing properly if you're not gonna speak at a proper rate constantly? It's just one of those things. Now, our last section here involves the coordination of everything we have talked about. And of course, everything revolves around doing everything correct altogether. And with that, when developing a voice, you got to try to extend a vocal range to maximize their potential, which there's a lot to do with that, and I'm aware. You also have to develop a consistent production in range out of your students, and so being able to get that out of them. And then they also have to develop up a flexibility and agility, which a lot of that is in the breathing mechanism. And then this one is one that I am more recent to experience with achieving a balanced vibrato, because that's something I'm still working on myself. Because vibrato, it's the pulsation of a pitch. It's kind of like if you're holding out a pitch, yeah. A piano is not going to sound with vibrato, but a human voice or any other instrument that's not percussive can. And then when you're exercising the voice, you should use warm-ups that require articulatory skills, meaning in uses of consonants, vowels, being able to say specific words, or resonatory skills, or get them used to being able to get the right placement in their voice to resonate correctly. And it's obvious there isn't really any exercises that magically bring vocal success to everybody, because nothing is perfect, ever. And in extending the range, which is something that I mentioned just a minute or so ago, you need the main factors associated with the ability to sing high or low. You have energy, space, and depth. I'm going to put it simply. When you sing higher, you need to use more of all three of those, and when you sing lower, use less. But the key is to never physically or mentally reach up or down for high or low notes. So like for me, I'm not going to try to reach for that. I'm also not going to try to reach for that. And lastly, when lining up the voice, is you'll line them up through vowels, registers, and resonance. With registers in particular, you're mostly going to find students singing in modal voice, because that's because you don't want to place somebody in a voice part where they're never getting to use their normal voice. It would be weird and unusual for them. And obviously resonance, you gotta be able to get them to match, or else the chord is not going to ever ring. And then obviously vowels, for any choir necessarily, you need to have a unity in your vowels if you're all saying the same or singing the same lyrics or words. It's like that chord isn't necessarily going to ring either, and I'm aware I'm not playing a major chord anymore. Or that chord's not going to ring if the vowels aren't in place, if the resonances aren't together, or for where each of those notes are for each specific singer. It's not going to be either. And it could be questionable for some of the altos, because a lot of them are going to be mezzos anyways. Is for this B here. But they have to kind of line up. Well, that is the end of the presentation. Sorry I'm not actually showing you the presentation in itself, because I am literally just videoing in a small room. But thank you for listening to my lecture on why a hypothetical new basic vocal pedagogy class should use The Diagnosis and Correction of Vocal Faults by James C. McKinney as a required text for said course. Thank you.